is Alex again. He's going to present the European Union and the role of Robert Schuman in setting up the European Union and the impact that Columban had on him. So we're going to dedicate this session to one of our people who died very recently, Aidan Larkin. Aidan was a barrister, he was a politician, he joined the Diocese of Dublin and went as a missionary to Chile and then joined the Columbanus, and unfortunately he died last week. So he has produced a fine book on Columban, St. Columban, Pilgrim for Christ. He also produced one on St. Patrick. So we will remember him during this presentation.
So good afternoon again. The background to this talk was last year the Heritage Council approached me for the European Year of Cultural Heritage in 2018 across Europe. And they wanted me to really look at the idea of Europe, and so I chose to look at Robert Schuman, Columbanus, and the idea of Europe. So that's kind of the background to today's talk. For a saint who's largely been forgotten in his homeland, that's changing now, but celebrated as a great European saint in other parts of Europe, the recent papal visit of Pope Francis to Ireland in August last year provided an opportunity for the memory of St. Columbanus to be honoured and celebrated in his homeland. At the end of August, both Pope Francis and the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, mentioned Columbanus in their speeches at the civic reception held in Dublin Castle, while Pope Francis twice mentioned Columbanus in his homily the following day during Mass in the Phoenix Park. Despite the vast chronological gap that separates both Columbanus and Robert Schuman, what connects them was their idea of Europe. Columbanus was one of the first to voice the idea of Europe as a distinct community, while Schuman sought to build a new supranational community in Europe after the Second World War that was inspired by the same heritage and thought that had motivated Columbanus. Now, 67 years after the Treaty of Paris that ratified the start of European economic integration, when the future of the European Union itself is uncertain, it's an opportune time to reflect on the origins and ideas that first underlay and gave impetus to this movement of European integration. What does Europe now mean, and what does it mean to be European, when much of the ideological foundations that supported the historical development of Europe have fallen away, or been discarded as irrelevant or cumbersome in many contemporary European societies? When history as an academic subject is increasingly relegated to the sidelines in our schools and universities, does the past have anything to say to us today? Can we still learn from our past? So these are some of the questions that I want to explore by, as it were, framing Columbanus and Robert Schuman as bookends to the development of the idea of Europe. We need to be reminded that two great European statesmen, the British Winston Churchill and the French Robert Schuman, both intimated that Britain would not form a constitutive element in the European community of nations. The seeds of Brexit were already sown at the very start of the European project. While later advocating that France take the lead in building a United States of Europe, Churchill in the 1930s did not see Britain as a natural partner in this venture. We have our own dreams and our own task. We are with Europe, but not of it. We are linked, but not comprised. We are interested and associated, but not absorbed. Likewise, Schuman commented, England does not, in my opinion, appear to be a good example of the European spirit. It's a question of different frames of mind in terms of political education and national tradition. In 1963, he presciently predicted that the British cannot imagine being prisoners of a commitment like this for a 50-year period. Quite extraordinary. The day after the Schuman Declaration in May 1950 in Paris, Schuman travelled to London with Jean Monnet to meet with his British counterparts. He was met with a decidedly frosty reception. I immediately felt that our plan had provoked coolness among our English friends. We, the French, had hoped that the English would fully adhere to our plan, give a few final touches, and when the government found it difficult to fit such a project with their country and the British frame of mind, Schuman even offered in May 1950 accession to the community via a purely contractual link, free from institutional subordination. In the wake of the devastation of the Second World War, a small group of Christian Democrat politicians, Robert Schuman in France, Konrad Adenauer in Germany, and Alcide de Gasperi in Italy, came together to build a supranational political framework that would bring the war-torn countries of Europe together and ensure that future war in Europe would be untenable. Within the context of the burgeoning Cold War and escalating tensions between the United States and Soviet Russia, this was a daring and innovative move. On the suggestion of the French financier and economist Jean Monnet, the then French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman proposed to merge the coal and steel production of France and Germany into a common authority, the Schuman Declaration of 9th of May 1950. The idea was a first practical step in the reunification of Europe. It led to the formation of the European Coal and Steel Community, the forerunner to the modern European Union. Schuman, Adenauer, and de Gasperi were all from contested border regions within Europe. Schumann's roots lay in the Lorraine, although he was born in Luxembourg, Adenauer's in the Rhineland, and de Gasperi in the Trentino region of northern Italy. All were also devout Catholics, inspired by the Christian heritage of Europe to form a model of solidarity for the new European societies they hoped to build. They were all equally influenced by the Thomism of the neo-scholastic movement from the end of the 19th century that witnessed the revival in interest in the philosophy of the 13th century Dominican theologian St. Thomas Aquinas and the Catholic social teaching of the popes from Leo XIII to Pius XII. Having all survived persecution under the Nazis and Italian fascists and witnessed the destruction of nihilistic and materialistic ideologies, they emerged after the war convinced of the necessity of rebuilding Europe on Christian democratic foundations. But the idea of Europe first emerged in the early and high Middle Ages, and it's to this period that I now wish to turn. The period of my interest, the period between 400 and 1200 AD, saw the emergence of new fundamental modes of identification in Europe. Firstly, strong religious identities took shape and became dominant over vast regions where Christian communities developed. And secondly, new kingdoms with ethnic denominations were formed, and the Roman Empire gave way to a pluralistic political landscape. Most ethnic designation for medieval and modern states, France, England, Scotland, Hungary, and many other, go back to this period. Both processes, not least through their interaction, created new forms of social cohesion, but also of conflict, and had a deep impact on European history up to the present day. All of these early medieval states that used ethnicity as their basis were Christian. This was partly due to the fact that the new kingdoms, the barbarian kingdoms, needed some Roman-type infrastructure, and bishops could help to create it. But there was a further element. Christianity could give purpose and meaning to the ethnic states. Throughout European history, the Church was the guardian of the universal principle. Super-ethnic ideas of church and Christian empire remained attractive throughout this period. For a while, the universal tendencies of Christianity seemed to gain ascendance through the association with the Roman Empire. But following the fall of the Roman Empire in the West from the end of the 5th century and the emergence of Germanic barbarian kingdoms, Christian authors were confronted with a much more complicated world, which may have reminded them of the ethnic universe and plurality of the Old Testament. The Oxford medieval historian R.W. Southern once noted that it is easy to forget that the idea of the unity of Western civilization with which we are familiar arises from a radical simplification of the past. This simplification is justified, but it's well to begin by remembering that Europe has always been the scene of more or less deep disunity and of conditions which to a close observer must appear chaotic. So the idea of Western or Latin Christendom emerged from the disunity and the particular social and political context of this post-Roman early medieval world. The universal mission of Christianity, which Christ gave to his apostles, was the basis of the medieval notion of Christendom. The practical disposal of Christians on the surface of the earth gave frontiers to what was universal by definition. External threats to Western Europe served to give cohesion to a fledgling sense of unity. The rapid rise of Islam in the 7th century and the speed with which Islamic armies conquered the Christian territories of the Byzantine Empire in the Holy Land and Egypt, and then conquered most of Spain in the 8th century, served to unify disparate ethnic groups to respond to this threat. The term Europeans is first used by an 8th century chronicler to describe the composite forces under the leadership of the Frankish commander Charles Martel, who defeated a Muslim army at the Battle of Tours in 732, the furthest north a Muslim army ever came in Europe. This doesn't mean that Latin Christendom was monolithic. Europe has always been characterized by its regionalism and diversity, and it remained so during this time. For the early Middle Ages, it's more helpful to think in terms of what's been called micro-Christendoms, local variants on a common Christian culture that were highly regionalized. Whether it was Ireland, Anglo-Saxon England, Visigothic Spain, or Armenia, each articulated its own particular vision of what it meant to be a Christian society. This only began to change from the 8th century onwards, when the balance of power in Europe shifted with the rise of the Frankish Carolingian dynasty and the creation of the Carolingian Empire. Apart from the British Isles and the Kingdom of Asturias in northern Spain, virtually no Latin Christians acknowledged any overlord but Charlemagne and his successors. And this was an empire that would eventually comprise 1 million square miles. Charles's empire was truly European in its scale, and the scholars who flocked to his court palace at Aachen saw his empire within a European perspective. So under the Carolingian dynasty, the concept of Western Christendom and Western Europe as a distinct cultural, religious, and political zone began to crystallize. This corresponded with the move by the papacy to distance itself from the Eastern or Byzantine Empire and to align itself with the Carolingian dynasty. The coronation of Charlemagne as emperor by Pope Leo III in 800 marked a decisive turning point and the creation of a new Roman Empire in the West. It was foremost a Western Christian empire, distinct from that of the Greek Eastern Empire in Constantinople. In a contemporary poem from the early 9th century, Charlemagne is termed head of the world, ruling his second Rome at Aachen. He is Europe's lighthouse and is called Father of Europe. After Charlemagne's conquest of the Lombard kingdom in Italy, an Anglo-Saxon scholar, Cathwolf, exhorted Charlemagne to show gratitude to God because he has raised you to the honour of the kingdom of Europe's glory. Cathwolf did not see Europe in terms of a single kingdom, but was stressing that Charlemagne had been exalted to wield rule in all of Europe. So this world of mixed Roman, Christian and Germanic, shaped by the power of ideological warrior kings ruling from Barcelona to Hamburg and from Aachen to Rome, left a deep imprint on the following centuries. Regional micro-Christendoms survived, but for the first time their various representatives came together to create what they considered to be the one true Christendom, which is seen within the framework of a Frankish-dominated Europe. So the idea of Western Christendom and Europe began to merge. So over time, they became synonymous. While Dante never used the term Europeans, but merely the inhabitants of Europe, by the time of Pope Pius II in the mid-15th century, the Pope was using the term European as a synonym for Christian, and this interchangeable use of the term continued into the 17th century. In Abraham Ortelius' Thesaurus Geographicus of 1578, for example, we find under Christiani vide Europei, Christians see Europeans. Thus, the idea of Europe as a distinct geopolitical, cultural, and religious zone developed during the course of this period to define Western European societies. For the ancient Greeks and Romans, Europe had merely been a geographical term devoid of any greater meaning, simply the third part of the known world after Asia and Africa. So Columbanus was one of the first to use the term in a new way. Columbanus may have been a member of the royal Leinster dynasty of the Eborca from southern Leinster, and probably grew up in the shadow of Mount Leinster. As a young man, he left home and travelled north to Ulster, first to study with renowned scriptural scholar Synillus, probably Abbas Synillus of Cleanish in County Fermanagh, and after his training there, entered monastic life in Bangor Abbey in County Down. He remained there for a number of years until around 590, when his request to leave Ireland as an ascetic exile or peregrinus was granted by his abbot. He left the shores of Belfast Lough with 12 companions for the coast of Brittany, and from there travelled inland. Over the years, Columbanus established 3 successive monastic foundations near the Vosges mountains of eastern France at Annegray, Luxeuil and Fontaine, under the patronage of the local Frankish Merovingian kings. The foundations proved successful, attracting novices and the sons of aristocrats to be educated in the monastic school there. In 610, however, he and the Irish and British monks, who comprised the senior members of his communities, were banished from the kingdom following cultural and political disagreements. Deported back to Ireland from Nantes, but somehow they managed to escape and found sanctuary with rival kings in the north and east of the Merovingian Gaul, where they sailed up the Rhine to Lake Constance and Bregenz, where Columbanus established his 4th monastery. His foundation at Bregenz proved short-lived and it met with setbacks. The changing political climate and the military defeat of his new benefactors in 612 forced Columbanus and his monks to push on once again across the Alps into northern Italy. From Milan, Columbanus received the support of the Lombard king and queen, who granted him the site of Bobbio in the Ligurian Apennines, the site of his 5th and final monastery, where he died in November 615. In the surviving corpus of writings, which constitute the earliest surviving literary body of work by an Irish author, and include monastic rules, letters, hymns, a handbook of penance, and a series of spiritual conferences he gave to his monks, Columbanus was not only the first to express a sense of Irish identity in writing, but also one of the first to express the idea of Europe as a distinct geopolitical and religious zone that would become coterminous with Latin or Western Christendom. As an outsider and immigrant from the periphery of the medieval world who travelled from Ireland into the heart of Europe, Columbanus transcended ethnic and political boundaries. Inspired by a Christian understanding of the human person and of the body politic, Columbanus, following a Pauline theology, advocated a unity above that of ethnic and political divisions. In his conflict with the bishops in Gaul over their attempts to control his monasteries and monastic customs, he wrote to them that we are all joint members of one body, whether Gauls or Britons or Irish or whatever people we come from. In successive letters written to popes, he repeatedly called for unity and concord. And it's in this context that he twice uses the term the whole of Europe, Totius Europae. In a letter written around 600 from Burgundy to Pope Gregory the Great in Rome, Columbanus addresses the Pope to the Holy Lord and Father in Christ, the fairest ornament of the Roman Church, as it were a most august flower of all Europe in her decay. The imagery here used by Columbanus is complex. Columbanus compares the Pope to a flower of a wilting, dried-out Europe. As one historian has commented on this passage, the rhetorical contrast between a wilting Europe and its spiritual head reveals a new cultural landscape, however rugged and as yet fitful. By contrast, Pope Gregory still saw himself and Rome within the imperial context of the Eastern Roman Empire. He was a servant of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, and Rome was at that time the westernmost frontier of the Byzantine Empire. Columbanus' second letter, letter to Pope Boniface IV, written this time from Milan in 613, was a call for unity within the Church. He begins with the address to the most fair head of all the churches of the whole of Europe. So the Pope is seen to be the head of a European body of churches. In this period, this meant above all Western Transalpine Europe, as opposed to the Eastern Roman Empire. Although Jonas of Bobbio, Columbanus' Italian biographer, who wrote an account of the saint's life, never used the term Europe, his detailed account of Columbanus' journeys from Ireland to Italy reads like an early travelogue through Western Europe and anchors Columbanus' vision within a concrete geographical and political framework. So by the end of the 7th century, we find a clear reference to Europe. The life of Gertrude of Nivelles, she was already mentioned this morning, a saint from northern France, Belgium. Her life was written in the late 7th century. The author asks rhetorically, for who living in Europe does not know the loftiness, the names and the localities of her lineage? Gertrude's death on the 17th of March was also noted that this was the day of St. Patrick's feast day, 17th of March. Columbanus' death at Bobbio in 615 marked the culmination of a remarkable European odyssey that he had begun some 25 years before, when he had set sail from Ireland with a group of 12 monks. Columbanus transcended the petty factionalism and ethnic myopia of his environment by appealing to a supranational sense of unity grounded in scriptural authority, the message most fully expressed by St. Paul that we are all one in Christ. As an outsider and immigrant, Columbanus was capable of transcending the ethnic, political, and religious divides of his time by appealing to a sense of a supranational unity of which he saw the Pope as a spiritual head. While the full extent of this vision would not be worked out until the following centuries, Columbanus gave voice to a new continent that was taking shape in the aftermath of the fall of the Roman Empire. In the post-war period, men like Schuman, de Gasperi, and Adenauer drew on the same ideas and resources in their plans to build a new Europe from the ruins of war. Robert Schuman was born in 1886 in Clausen, a suburb of Luxembourg. He had lost both his parents by the age of 25 and briefly considered joining a monastery before a friend persuaded him that his talents lay elsewhere. He remained a bachelor and a daily mass goer for the rest of his life. He finalized his legal studies and became a lawyer in Metz in 1912, which at that time was part of the German Reich. Though born in Luxembourg, his father had been from Lorraine, so he thought of himself as a Lorrainer and spoke French with a German accent. Due to his ill health, Schuman was not fit to serve in World War I, but saw out the war as a civil servant for the Germans. He began his political career in 1919 as a member of parliament for the Moselle region in the French Parliament. By the outbreak of the Second World War, Schuman was working in the Council for Refugees, but on returning to Metz in September 1940, was arrested by the Gestapo and held in solitary confinement for several months before the Nazis tried to persuade him to collaborate with them. He was kept under house arrest by the Gauleiter, Joseph Burkel, a high-ranking Nazi official close to Hitler, who tried to turn Schuman, and who had been the man responsible for the deportation of the Austrian Jews. Schuman managed to escape on the 1st of August 1942 and crossed the Vosges Mountains into Free France, taking with him vital data for the resistance and the first qualified news of the Holocaust. In discussions with the Benedictine abbot of Ligogé near Poitiers after his escape, he told the Benedictine abbot, this is August 1942, "The Jews are being systematically destroyed. There are no more Jews in Ukraine. Men, women and children have been separated and taken. Men and women have been transported to concentration camps. Often they are sent with hardly any water and without food. They are left to die of starvation and cold. They are often made to dig huge trenches, and then they are then shot in front of them. They are set on fire with petrol, then covered in lime and earth. The Polish Jews are often destroyed by such radical methods. They are transported, separating father, mothers and children. When the German populations are transported, the families are transferred. The same also goes for those from Alsace-Lorraine. But they had to leave without taking practically anything with them, leaving their country and finding themselves in very difficult conditions." So Schuman goes into hiding for the next 2 years until the end of the war, upon which he was re-elected to the Moselle region as a Member of Parliament. In 1948, he was appointed Foreign Minister and was with Winston Churchill for the Hague Congress on European Unity, in which Churchill advocated European integration. That same year, the Soviets had blockaded Berlin, and the following year, 1949, NATO was signed in Washington, D.C., and the Soviets successfully exploded their first atomic bomb. So it's in this fraught political climate that led to Schuman becoming involved in orchestrating an academic congress on Columbanus, and where the two strands of our story converge in unexpected ways. Towards the end of the summer 1948, Professor Gabriel Lebras, a jurist and sociologist at the Sorbonne, was summoned by Schuman. Schuman wanted to organize a summit, but was not in a position to do so openly. His position was tenuous because he did not have the support of the National Assembly. Lebras, a Breton who had a particular interest in Columbanus, persuaded Schuman of the cultural and religious importance of the saint, and especially of his European dimension. Luxeuil was also well situated because it was far from Paris and close to Schumann's electoral base in Lorraine. But due to his position as advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Professor Lebras could not be seen as a principal organizer of the conference. He instead approached a former student and colleague at the Sorbonne to act as the official organizer, a young lady, Marie Dubois, a French Anglo-Saxon philologist who subsequently published a book on Columbanus in 1950 and which Schuman read. The Congress was organized by Dubois, but it provided Schuman with the perfect cover to discuss his plans in secret with European and American diplomats. Schuman needed allies and to make alliances at this delicate stage before launching the project on the political scene. Delegations from Austria, Belgium, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Vatican, and the United States were all invited. From the start, the Irish were enthusiastic supporters for the project. 3 days before the start of the Congress on the 21st of July 1950, Schuman met with Con Cremin, an Irish diplomat, who became the Irish ambassador to Paris some months after the conference. Cremin sent a confidential memorandum to the Irish Minister for Foreign Affairs, Sean MacBride. Schuman sought Ireland's assistance and support over the questions of the Korean War, which has just broken out, and the French position in Indochina, which he understood as a fight against communism, and to gauge the position of Britain, who had initially refused to take part in the elaboration of his plan. He thought that Ireland could be an important dialogue partner with Britain to bring them on board. Schuman would discuss these issues with Sean MacBride in person during the course of the Luxeuil Congress. So behind the scenes of a relatively arcane academic conference, political discussions of a high level were taking place. The Irish delegation consisted of Sean MacBride, as well as the Taoiseach, John A. Costello, and the leader of the opposition, Eamon de Valera. At the close of the conference, the Taoiseach, John Costello, made reference to the Schuman Declaration of the 9th of May and made the link between Columbanus and a Europe united under Christian values. As did Sean MacBride, who remarked in his speech, "If we remove from Europe her Christian civilization, what remains will not be very important." In his vision for the future of Europe, Schuman drew inspiration from the social encyclicals of Popes Leo XIII to Pius XII, the political philosophy of the French Catholic writer Jacques Maritain, and the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, with which he was well versed. This was a political philosophy grounded in the gospel and focused on how to build societies centred on the common good. Yet Schuman was not advocating a return to theocracy, but clearly understood the necessity for the division of church and state. Schuman was deeply conscious of the historical context that had given rise to Western European civilization, and of the similarities between his own time and that of the early medieval world. In his political manifesto, Pour l'Europe, or For Europe, which was published posthumously soon after his death in 1963, and which he collated from his numerous political speeches, he stressed the importance of cohesion for the European peoples. While Monnet's idea of pooling coal and steel production provided the start-up experiment on a practical level of binding France and Germany closer together, Schuman was well aware that the project would ultimately flounder if it remained primarily an economic and technical enterprise. The whole cannot and must not remain an economic and technical enterprise. It needs a soul, the conscience of its historical affinities and of its responsibilities in the present and in the future, and a political will at the service of the same human ideal. He was fully aware of the dangers of excessive bureaucracy and technocracy, and the kind of paralysis that this could lead to. European integration must, generally speaking, avoid the mistakes of our national democracies, especially excessive bureaucracy and technocracy. Administrative paralysis is a basic danger that threatens any supranational organization. Schuman's vision was much more ambitious and far-reaching. The economic and technical merger was merely the preliminary conditions in creating, in his own words, a cultural community in the most elevated sense of the term. This was to be a community fostered by education, free movement of peoples within Europe, conscious of their historical affinities and ties. European unity would not, he realized, be achieved by European institutions on their own. European unity will not be achieved exclusively or chiefly by the European institutions. The establishment of these institutions will go hand in hand with intellectual progress. He also stressed the Christian foundations of democracy. National isolationism or exceptionalism was no longer tenable in the post-war period, which called for subsidiarity and cooperation. Schuman was adamant that Europe needed its own army and defence as crucial to European federation. France's refusal to ratify the European Defence Community Treaty, or EDC, in 1954 came as a severe blow to Schuman and to federalists' hopes for a genuine supranational community. In his address to NATO in 1959, Schuman voiced his ideas of what the West stood for. The West is not a simple geographical notion, not merely one of two parts of a duality of East and West, but a cultural and political classification. In his perspective, Soviet Russia was inimical to the West, and Schuman was under no illusions about the need of the West to defend itself against Russian aggression. Hence the need for a European army under the supreme command of NATO. Following 1954 and the failure to ratify the EDC, Christian democratic influence began to wane in France. Schuman retired in 1960 and died 3 years later, soon after the world had come to the brink of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. He died exactly 1 week after Martin Luther King's historic I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Was Schuman's own dream for the future of European integration stillborn from the start? One recent historian of Schuman, Alan Phimister, has commented, "The Christian democratic Thomism of Robert Schuman has imposed a lasting character upon the European project, which sits uncomfortably with the present secular age. The purely secular forces behind integration do not require these elements, and without the power of Christian democracy, secular utopian federalism was too weak to push national governments beyond the intergovernmental level. Secular utopian federalism and Catholic solidarism differ markedly in that the former seeks the replacement of the sovereign nation state with a new sovereign federal entity, where the latter seeks to build a supranational edifice upon the essentially natural foundations of enduring nation states. According to Phimister, in the absence of genuine Christian democracy, the debate is dominated by secular nationalists who seek to confine sovereignty to its natural frontiers in the existing nation state. The communitarian Europe is left as a no man's land between them. With a decline in Christianity in the West, which provided a unifying moral and soteriological framework for so many centuries, and which substantially shaped European societies and values, the loss of this cohesive meta-narrative, coupled with rising inequality, poses grave risks for the future of genuine democracy in Europe. As the British journalist and political commentator Douglas Murray has recently observed in his 2017 book, The Strange Death of Europe, at any time, the loss of all unifying stories about our past or ideas about what to do with our present or future would be a serious conundrum. But during a time of momentous societal change and upheaval, the results are proving fatal. The world is coming into Europe at precisely the moment that Europe has lost sight of what it is. He concludes his book with, "Any solution to our crisis would also involve not only a fresh attitude towards our future, but a more balanced attitude towards our past. It is not possible for society to survive if it routinely suppresses and otherwise fights against its own origins. For my own part, I cannot help feeling that much of the future of Europe will be decided on what our attitude is towards the church buildings and other great cultural buildings of our heritage standing in our midst. Around the questions of whether we hate them, ignore them, engage with them, or revere them, a huge amount will depend. Common stories not only inform and shape who we are, they also influence and shape our social reality. In making connections with our past and with acknowledging the historical roots of Europe, we can perhaps better navigate the future. What is less acknowledged today in EU institutions and in society more generally are the Christian semantic and philosophical roots that lay behind the European project from the very beginning. The idea of European unity that Columbanus first tentatively voiced some 1,400 years ago, and which in turn inspired Robert Schuman at the start of his very own European venture. Thank you.